Did Matthew mistranslate Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14 to say that a virgin would give birth and make this into the birth of Jesus? Or did he accurately translate something that would be one of the greatest miracles in the history of humanity? More on that on this episode of All Rise.
All rise, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. It's me, your host, Derek Caldwell, back once again with author and speaker Abdu Murray. And we are back with you today for part 2 of our episode on our Christmas episode, responding to some claims that Bart Ehrman made. Now, for continuity's sake, we did come back 2 weeks later wearing the same clothes so that it would look just showbiz magic, Abdu. They'll never know.
Yeah.
So you look great, though. You look great.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah,
You still look terrific.
Yeah. I recently saw some old photos of Abdu, I think from high school, and he was one of those guys, and everyone knows this. When you look in your high school yearbook and you see someone whose neck is twice the size of their head, like football players, and I never knew, did you put your shoulders forward to get that effect, or is that just, were you just a muscular neck
my natural, muscular girth.
Yeah, okay.
But you also saw, and people might see this one of these days when they look back on stuff, and if we ever air any of these things, a photo of me with the classic Middle Eastern American guy mustache and the incredibly awful mullet.
Yeah.
Which I would sometimes tie back into a ponytail when I was playing basketball or doing martial arts.
Wow.
And so I looked like a poor man's version of Steven Seagal.
Wow. Or you could say like what's a good Middle Eastern name, first name, and then I'll make my joke.
Omar
Dirt.
Like Joe Dirt. Okay.
Yeah. Regular Omar Dirt here.
Yeah.
I don't know why I couldn't. I just wanted to get a really good stereotypical name. So thank you for helping with that.
Yeah. Always happy to perpetuate stereotypes.
Yeah. So Joe Dirt, another Christmas classic. That may not be true. Anyway, we are ready to stop wasting everyone's time. That's my fault. And
usually.
But we want to let's go ahead. So today we're going to talk about, as you heard at the top of the show, whether Matthew, did he mistranslate? Did he just not understand the original text of Isaiah 7 and the context of it? But this has been a long-standing sort of argument against Christians that and people point out different prophecies, but this one in specifically, the idea of they got it wrong. Isaiah was talking about a young woman, not a virgin, and this whole virgin thing the Christians kind of made up in order to make Jesus's birth seem miraculous. So this is something we've faced a lot, but we're going to go into some depth here today. And so let's listen again to, this is part 2 of the video where Bart Ehrman's being interviewed by Alex, what's his last name again?
O'Connor.
I always forget that part, and I don't know why. But Alex O'Connor, formerly known as the Cosmic Skeptic. I don't think he goes by that anymore. This is new and improved Alex O'Connor. And so let's go ahead and listen in as they talk about this passage.
Can I ask you about mistranslations of Old Testament verses in general? Yeah. Are there sort of other examples of what we might consider to be translation blunders in the New Testament?
Oh boy, yeah, are there? Matthew's kind of famous for this. The one that's the most famous one is, again, in the birth narrative in Matthew. Both Matthew and Luke, as I said, have Jesus born of a virgin. One of the interesting differences is why he had to be born of a virgin. In Luke's gospel, Luke says the reason he had to be born of a virgin, it's in the Annunciation. The angel Gabriel comes to Mary and says, "You're going to conceive a child." She says, "What? Never had sex. I'm not going to have sex." No, the Holy Spirit's going to get you pregnant. And the angel says to her in Luke 1:35, the Holy Spirit shall come upon you. The power of the Most High will overshadow you, so that the one born of you shall be called holy, the Son of God. So Mary gets pregnant by the Spirit so that Jesus is the divine Son of God in Luke. That's not Matthew's view. Matthew doesn't say anything like that. Matthew says that she had to be a virgin to fulfill the Scriptures, because the Scripture says that a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. That's a quotation of Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. In this case, it's really there. Isaiah 7:14 is there, and it says something like that.
It's a good start.
But it's a good
start that it's actually in the Old
It's a
Testament
good start.
this time.
It's a good start. So it's
Zinger.
there. The problem is
Got 'em.
that Matthew is quoting it in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And when you actually read the Hebrew, it does not say, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. And in fact, when you read it in the context of Isaiah, it's clear as day that it's not talking about that, and it's not talking about a Messiah at all.
Is that so? I mean,
Yeah.
because the word used in the Hebrew Old Testament is the word alma,
Yes.
which can mean virgin.
Yes.
It can also mean what? Young woman.
Well, it doesn't mean it means young woman, but it's young woman irrespective of whether she's had sex or not.
Sure. And the Greek translation in the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
For our listeners, the New Testament's written in Greek.
That's right.
The Old Testament is written in Hebrew.
That's right.
Which means that the New Testament writers were reading a Greek translation
That's
of
right.
the Old Testament when
right.
they wrote the New Testament. And the Greek version of the Old Testament uses the word, is it Parthenos,
That's right.
which does mean virgin.
Well, it also means young woman.
So you said a moment ago that you think it's. I mean, I've heard before that there's a bit of a sort of translation problem here, but you said it's clear that this is not what's meant in this passage.
Oh, yeah.
How do we know that?
Well, nobody reads the passage. That's the thing. People read the verse, right?
Yeah.
So the passage is really quite clear. So the deal is that Isaiah. So it's written by a fellow named Isaiah in Jerusalem in the 8th century BCE, and he's a prominent figure in at the time in Jerusalem. The king of Judah, Ahaz, is under threat. Two opposing armies have laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, and it looks like Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. And Ahaz is freaking out about this. He calls in the prophet Isaiah, and Isaiah says that God will give you a sign to show that it's not going to happen, that you're not going to be destroyed. The sign is that a young woman who has conceived will bear a son, and when the son is old enough to know the difference between good and evil, can eat curds and whey and knows the difference between good and evil, these two kings will disperse. They will be gone. They're not going to. And so he's saying, give it time and they will go away of their own. You're not even going to have to fight the war. So there are two translational issues. One is he doesn't use the Hebrew word that means a woman who's never had sex, Bethula. He uses just the word for young woman. And the Hebrew tense is the young woman has conceived. She's pregnant. Before she gives birth, before the child she bears is very old, you won't have these political problems anymore. So it's a young woman has conceived. It's not a virgin will conceive. And it's not talking about a future Messiah. It's talking about some woman here who's pregnant, and about what's going to happen to the city. So it's not even a messianic prophecy. It's not a prophecy of a future Messiah.
So there was a lot there. Actually, some of it's true. It's not even all completely false, but some of it is also kind of missing the point of some things. And we'll get into some of the textual issues, but just as a rundown quickly again, the main points of contention are that Matthew and Luke give different reasons for why Jesus was born of a virgin. Luke 1:35 says that it's so that the one born shall be called holy, the Son of God. And Matthew says that it's to fulfill the scriptures, that he shall be called Emmanuel, God with us. So that's kind of the main contention. We'll focus a lot on the Isaiah 7 verse there that Matthew is referring to. He's saying that the Hebrew doesn't say a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, but just a young woman. And that, in context, that's all it needs to mean too. So, the textually, sort of in the Hebrew language, and contextually, it doesn't need to mean, and it doesn't mean virgin. There's no reason for it to. It just means a woman who's there. And he says that the word itself does not mean virgin. It means young woman. It can imply virginity, but doesn't need to. It's just a young woman. And Ehrman says that the context is this, that Isaiah writes in Jerusalem around the 8th century BC. It's, the king of Judah, Ahaz, is under threat. There's two opposing armies that are coming to him. He's freaking out. Isaiah said God will give Ahaz a sign, and the sign will be that this young woman who has already conceived, that's important, not will conceive, but who has already conceived, will bear a son. And by the time he's 2 years old, Ahaz can rest. The threat will be over. Those other armies will be dealt with. And so that was really kind of the sign. It wasn't to be like this miracle or whatever. It was just to wait for that and trust God through that. And then there are these translation issues that we've kind of already talked about. But Isaiah doesn't use the Hebrew word that means a woman who has never had sex, which is Bethula. Instead, he uses the word for young woman. In the Hebrew, text says that the young woman has conceived and that she's already pregnant. So it's not a messianic prophecy of one to come. It's a prophecy about just a kid who's going to be born then, and that's the sign. And it's sort of very mundane. So as we start off, I think a good place to start is just maybe this idea, Dr. Ehrman talks about these two different reasons, and he makes a big deal about this. I think one of the things he maybe fails to realize, he doesn't, he has to know this, but in this instance where sort of like you've talked about in the last episode too, everything the Christians say has to be wrong. But the idea is, that one thing couldn't possibly mean two different things, could it? It couldn't be sort of layered with meaning or whatever. But that is kind of the culture he's talking about, a place that put a lot of meaning into single things all the time. But how would you sort of start to respond to that? Two different reasons.
Yeah, so a couple of things that jump out to me, Derek, is as I was listening to the clip, is that he says something that I just find remarkable, especially in light of our previous episode, where his words were, well, nobody reads the passage. That's the problem. In other words, they read the verse, but not the whole passage in the context and all this stuff. And he's not always guilty of not reading the context. He does sometimes, and he goes about the context here. I find that terribly ironic because one of the things in a previous episode was that in order to come to the conclusion that Matthew had to be very specific about which prophet he was talking about, comes from the text, when the text itself suggests that Matthew's talking about all the prophets put together, are conveying the idea that Jesus is someone who would be called a Nazarene in terms of that kind of person who you'd think of a Nazarene to be. So sometimes he violated the very rule he just said and made fun of people for saying that you don't read the whole passage. That's ironic because what he says in the video is he says that Luke has a lineage and saying that this is how he came to be so that he could be called the Son of God. But what Matthew says is different. Matthew is saying that this and this and this happened to Jesus so that he could fulfill the scriptures and fulfill the prophecy of 7:14. And he says that's a difference. Two things. One, he doesn't say, because he can't say, it's a contradiction. He's implying that it is. He's implying that those two things are irreconcilably different. They're not actually different. It sounds like they are based on the way he makes the tone sound, but just go back and actually listen to what he says and ask yourself, are those two things actually different? Are they actually different? They're not. They're actually not different at all. So he actually answers his own argument. His argument itself answers itself. It's not even really an argument. He says that Luke says that he will be born of a virgin so that he will be called the Son of God. And then Matthew says that he will be born of a virgin so that he will fulfill the scriptures in Isaiah 7:14 and Isaiah 9:6, which actually calls him God. He is, in fact, the divine being. So Isaiah is saying he fulfills this scripture, which is a scripture about the Son of God, and Luke is saying he was born of a virgin so that he would be called the Son of God. They're not saying different things. They're actually saying the same thing. Just because you make it sound like they're saying different things doesn't mean they're saying different things. They're simply saying the same thing. Luke is talking about this from one aspect of the same thing, and Matthew is bringing out another aspect, but it's just facets of the same diamond.
Yeah, especially, when you think about even the time where Jesus called God his Father, because he's saying I'm the Son of God, and you might read that and say, you see here he says he's the Son of God, so not God, and but Matthew's trying to say no, he's God with us. So it's in John's Gospel actually where Jesus says specifically, he's talking there. So I'll start here. So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working." So we're gonna see something about this. He just called God his Father. So, he's saying he's the Son. He's not saying he's the same thing as God, right? But for this reason, they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal to God. So here we see, if someone does want to see one saying he's God with us, one saying he's the Son of God, those are two different things. One's a lower rank. It's not, because the way Jesus is saying and the way the Gospels are portraying him, that is not a lower rank any more than, Abdu, you saying your son is of lesser value than you are. Clearly, and that's a biological distinction, obviously, which is not the case between God the Father and God the Son. But the idea is their ontological worth, or however you want to put it, is not different. And they see that there is an equality there. He's saying, I'm the same thing. Yeah.
And that, by the way, I'm so glad you brought that up, because Ehrman himself goes to great lengths to basically say that John's gospel, is being the latest gospel written, is an accretion of legends about Jesus that gets him higher and higher on the totem pole, as it were. Is that he's kind of divine in one sense in the synoptic gospels, but he's fully divine in John's gospel. And so he would basically say most of John can't be trusted in terms of the actual Christology. And so he takes a lot of time in a lot of his books to say you can't trust John's gospel theologically. It's a legend that developed later on over time. Why that's important is because what you just pointed out is that John himself is saying that when Jesus calls God his Father and he makes himself the Son of God, that is the same thing as saying, I am God.
Right.
Well, if it didn't say that, then Bart Ehrman would have no problem with it. But it does say that. And so even in Luke's gospel, where he says he would be called holy and the Son of God, it is clearly a divine title. He's not saying he's something else. So when Matthew is saying he's God with us, these are saying the exact same thing. You try to make it look like a difference in one spot, and this is something that some scholars do, and Ehrman does it occasionally. Well, he'll try to make it look like the title Son of God doesn't mean God when it's convenient for it not to mean that. But when it does mean it, it does mean it, but we can't take that seriously because that's what it means. So it's a way to get rid of both arguments at the same time. You got to be consistent. Either Son of God means God when Jesus is referring to himself in a divine way, or it doesn't. And because it does mean it in Luke's gospel, just as it means it in John's gospel, when Matthew says he is God with us, they're saying the same thing. To call it a difference, this isn't a difference. It's just a difference without a distinction, really.
Yeah, and when we look into some of the history of again, how this Isaiah passage was interpreted, and the messianic way it was interpreted by not just Christians, but even Jewish people, we'll see even again more. And maybe you can say a little bit too about the different sort of the focus of Matthew proving the divine identity, this sort of divine messianic identity, and the focus of Luke seems to be more on sort of the divine universal God over all, which makes sense because Luke was the traveling companion of Paul, the Jewish apostle to the Gentiles. So he's very much influenced by Paul's telling of things. But
I think you've nailed it
too,
right
and that's
there.
important. Yeah,
I think you've nailed it. Is that Matthew has a certain audience focus, and he's focusing on Jesus' identity in relation to the Old Testament scriptures as a Jew himself, and as writing to an audience who would recognize this. he's referencing those things. And so he's talking about the divinity of Christ in reference to the books that his audience finds authoritative. But Luke, not being a Jew, being a Gentile, who travels with a Jew, Paul, and who is encountering him, witnessing not only to Jews, but also to Gentiles all across the various parts of Rome, and is trying to get them to see that this God is the God of all peoples. Acts chapter 17. I mean, you have it right there, is that Luke records in the book of Acts Paul's effort to universalize the conception of who God really is to non-Jewish people. And so it would be no surprise then that Luke's genealogy starts with Adam, showing that Jesus is in fact the God of all people, and not just Jews, but of all people. And it's not limited to this parochial understanding of a genealogy that has to do with the patriarchs of Israel. Rather, it's the birth of humanity, and he's the God of all people. So this isn't surprising at all. Again, this comes down to two facets of the same reality. They're not saying different things. They're saying the same thing in different ways.
Yeah, so they're not contradictory, they're complementary. They are they're telling the same story just in different ways to different people, but they're not even really all that different. They're just filling in different parts of who Jesus is, because there is a lot to cover, and they're covering what's most pressing to their community, which would not be Abdu, if you were writing a legal brief for the court, or for a popular journal, judicial magazine or whatever, like these would be two different ways you would write about things to the people who need them. So, it's not all that uncommon. It's something we do today. But shifting from that, let's talk about what this word does actually mean, because a lot of it centers on Matthew translated this wrong. He seems to have no idea about what the word means or what the context was, and that's the general idea here. So let's start with the word. What does Alma mean anyway?
Yeah, and this is one of those things that I like the way Alex actually picked up on this. He's saying, so I've heard this a bunch of times, so it can mean virgin. And Ehrman, of course, says, yeah, it can mean, but it more commonly means just young woman, irrespective of whether she's had sex or not. And yeah, it may indeed simply imply a young woman. That may be the case. But what you'll notice in the text is that it almost always refers to an unmarried woman. And in Israel, because of the moral code, Genesis chapter 24, verses 43, Exodus 2:8, Psalm 68:25, you'll see that when Alma is used about an unmarried woman, it is strongly implied that she's a virgin, because otherwise that would be a different sort of moral case altogether. So I think that's important for us to know, is that it can mean that, but it almost always means an unmarried woman who is impliedly a virgin. Now, you look at in the comparison with the word batula, I think this will help to illustrate the point as well. That word doesn't necessarily mean virgin either. And Ehrman makes it sound like if you're going to be specific, if you were going to make sure that it was a virgin, then in the Hebrew you would have used the word Bethula. And Alma is so ambiguous that it basically doesn't mean that. But Bethula would be way more obviously specific. And the term can refer to somebody who's a virgin, Genesis 24:16, Leviticus 21:3. It can also refer to an old widow, by the way, who wouldn't necessarily be a virgin, Joel 1:8. So it could mean virgin, or it could mean someone of marriageable age as well. So it doesn't have to mean virgin. So that out of the gate, this idea that Bethula would be the word you would use if you meant virgin, that's just blown out of the water right then and there. That's simply not the case. It could be Alma, it could be Bethula. In fact, the reality was that if you were going to more, I think, convincingly convey virgin, Alma is the better word of the two. Bethula occurs 50 times in the Old Testament, and 12 are metaphorical, 14 are general. There are 26 times when it could explicitly mean a virgin. Of the 50 times, more than half can mean virgin. But the requirement is in the context, not in the word itself. As Mario would say, the actual idea in this usage is a woman of a marriageable age, or ready for marriage, as it were. Alma is found only 8 other times in the Old Testament, other than Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. And 2 of those are in musical notations, and the meaning is lost, so it doesn't have to mean a young woman, irrespective of her virginity. We don't know it in those two times what it means. And so three others are impossible to determine, but the three usages we do know about: Genesis 24:43, Exodus 2:8, and Song of Solomon 6:8, refers to unmarried girls, and again, strongly implying their virginity. J. Alec Matier helps to clarify this, and he looks at Genesis 24 and how the verse there helps us understand what these terms actually mean. Abraham's servant prays in 24:14 for a girl, Naara, to marry Isaac, and the approaching Rebekah in 24:16 is described as a female, Naara, of marriageable age, Betula, and single. No man has ever lain with her. Now, this is important. It's important to note that Betula is not sufficient by itself in this case to denote virginity, but it needs the explanatory phrase, no man has ever lain with her. So if Betula was obviously virgin, you say a virgin who no man has lain with. That's redundant. But you don't say that. He doesn't say that in the text. He says Betula, a young woman who no man has lain with or ever lain with. So it's got to be explained. And I think that's an important reason to believe that Betula doesn't necessarily mean virgin every time. And in verse 24, verse 43, in chapter 24, verse 43, in light of learning of all of this about Rebekah, the servant describes her as Alma, or a female, marriageable and unmarried, with the assumed virginity because of the context of these qualities. So the word Betula is used to describe her, and then the person describing her calls her an Alma in light of all of that stuff, including her virginity, that she is someone who's no one's ever lain with. And to quote Matier, he says that in the light of this, there is no ground for saying that Alma must mean young woman and not a virgin, and that Betula is the technical word for virgin. So that's just simply wrong. It's just not the case. And so when people overstate the case about this, I think that we should challenge them on it. Rather, to the contrary, Isaiah used the word which, among those available to him, Alma, Betula, other words, Alma came the nearest to expressing a virgin birth, one in which, in the event of someone who has conceived, she has conceived without actually having sex. So Alma comes the closest to conveying that. Of all the available words, Alma comes the closest of conveying that. It's also worth noting that outside the Bible, Alma is never used of a married woman. So in this particular instance, when we take the context that Ehrman likes so much in saying that it's just this woman who has conceived, so she must be married, and it's referring to Alma, outside of the Bible, the word Alma is not used of married women. So linguistically speaking, of all the resources available to us, the most reasonable translation of what the word Alma actually means is a young woman who is a virgin. Hey friends, I hope you've been enjoying All Rise and all of our digital content. If you have been enjoying it and you found value in this ministry, would you consider giving to Embrace the Truth? Your donations as the year comes to a close help not only us finish strong in 2024, but also plan for 2025 and all the digital content and in-person content we have planned. We have a new studio coming your way and tons of great content coming in 2025. As the year comes to a close and you consider your year-end giving, we would ask that you make Embrace the Truth a part of that. This is a listener and donor-supported program, as well as all of our ministry. So please consider Embrace the Truth as part of your year-end giving. You can do so by going to embracethetruth.org and looking at the donate buttons there, both in U.S. and Canada. Thank you so much for your support and your prayers and your viewing. God bless you. What's important here to note, too, is that Alma actually is referring to an unmarried woman. But in a betrothal stage, someone who's not married, but who is betrothed to be married. Eugene Penteuk, who is an expert in Semitic languages, points out that the term Alma may be derived from the word for hidden. In other words, the veiled one, and a woman who is betrothed is of a particular age. It would be preparing for marriage, and she would be a veiled one. So the prophecy may then refer to a person, a young woman, who is definitely a virgin, yet who is not yet married, but in the betrothal stage. And this word not only connotates virginity, but a young woman and someone who is not yet married, but is betrothed. And that's going to factor in pretty importantly later.
Yeah. I love the specificity of it is sort of, it's like closing in. And that's what I love. I mean, when you went through that Genesis 24, the way it sort of shows, here's all these words that someone could say, no, 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 that's the words you should use. And yet when all the context comes together, the author of Genesis picks Alma to sum it all up, because it's both young, marriageable age, unmarried, presumed virginity, all those things summed up in this one word. So it becomes this perfect word combined with the stage of life that she's in. But let's talk about the original context too. So we'll sort of discuss that as well, because that's another major issue for Ehrman. And he is actually, this is the one I mentioned, he's essentially correct on the context. A child is promised as a sign to King Ahaz that destruction will not come upon him and his kingdom. But one thing to sort of talk about first was that prophecy fulfilled? Because this could be, this for some people might be an issue. And so Isaiah 8 seems to imply that Isaiah and his wife, the prophetess, may have fulfilled the prophecy. But this doesn't seem to work, as his wife would not fit the criteria of what an Alma was, since she was already married and had conceived before. So this is either some sort of partial fulfillment or a different thing altogether, because the child of Isaiah 8 could be a different child, which makes sense given he's given a different name, different criteria as to what the meaning will be when he reaches a particular age. So, there's a little interpretive stuff you could kind of think through there. Some thought it was even perhaps King Ahaz's own son, Hezekiah. We'll talk about that a little bit later too, a little bit more, but just to kind of talk about that some here, this would actually be impossible because Hezekiah would have already been born by this time. He was born before Ahaz became the king of Judah. So we learn in 2 Kings that Ahaz became a king when he was 20. He reigned for 16 years, which means he was 36 when he died. Hezekiah was 25 when he took over for his father. This means that this is apparently not all that uncommon at that time in that place, but Hezekiah was born when Ahaz was about 11 years old, and so 9 years before he became king, based on those timelines. So, and linguistically, it just wouldn't make sense, because this the woman has conceived already at that point, but it looks like Hezekiah was already born. So, the other options don't seem to be all that great. And then, when you look at Isaiah 9, which appears to be referring back to the child from Isaiah 7, this is not a mere human child. Isaiah says, "For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given." Great. And the government will be on his shoulders. Okay, maybe son of the king, whatever. But then it says, "And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever." So it seemed like some divine character who would also reign from David's throne forever. We see that kind of picked up too in like Ezekiel 34 and other things, where it's God saying, "I'm going to send a shepherd, and I'm going to be the shepherd. I'm going to come to you, and also I'm going to send a shepherd, and that shepherd will be David, but David's dead by that time." So there's always this kind of double sort of thing that is happening in the text of God's going to come to us, but also David's going to come to us. And it's kind of the singular person that he's referring to coming, but somehow being both God and David. But also too, if the prophecy was partially fulfilled, that wouldn't actually matter. Now, it looks like maybe it wasn't fulfilled at all fully at the time, but even if it was sort of partially fulfilled, the eternal Davidic king was clearly not yet to be, because Judah is overtaken by Babylon in about 586 BC. So the destruction ultimately was not stopped, it was postponed. So there's clear that something has not actually fit the bill here.
Right. But even if it did fit the bill, at least partially speaking,
Right.
As you said before,
This happens a lot in the Bible.
Yeah, it happens all the time. And there is a immediate prophecy fulfillment and one that is to be fulfilled in the future. This happens quite a bit. But we think of this in common parlance as well. Or let me give you an example from, like stuff for pop culture. The movie The Sixth Sense. So you look at the movie The Sixth Sense, right? And spoiler alert, by the way, if you haven't seen The Sixth Sense, I'm going to ruin it for you. However, if you don't know how The Sixth Sense ends by now, you're either below the age of 12 or you just haven't been paying attention to much. The character of Bruce Willis plays in the movie has been dead almost the entire movie. He doesn't know it yet. And so he has his interactions with his wife, and you don't quite know because you don't get let on to the fact that he's been dead until the very end. And there's these little signs throughout the entire movie that he actually has been dead. And when you look and it's explained to you later at the end of the movie, you're like, oh my goodness, he was dead the whole time. And the audience, sort of falls out of their chairs. In fact, I think it's the only movie ever to have a higher number of ticket sales its second week than its first week because people wanted to go back and see all the details that they missed.
Brilliant.
Well, here's the thing. There's this scene in The Sixth Sense where Bruce Willis's wife, now Bruce Willis is dead, he's a ghost, but his wife is sitting at a table and it's their anniversary and she's commemorating the anniversary by going to the place where they had their first date. And she's clearly upset. She's clearly very sad. What you don't know is that she's actually sad because her husband has died and she's just remembering she's sad and remembering their anniversary on that day. Bruce Willis walks up as a ghost, and he's not able to interact with her, and she can't hear him. But he sits down, and he thinks she's mad at him. Because remember, he doesn't know he's dead. He thinks she's mad at him because he's late to the dinner because he's obsessed with his work. Now, that was a part of their marriage before he died. And so he assumes that this is what's going on right now. And he says something like, I thought you meant the other restaurant we had our first date at, or something like that to that effect, because he's trying to figure out why she's upset. And then she walks away. Now, as you're watching the movie, you actually don't know that he's dead. You're like with him, you're ignorant of it. And so she is literally upset. You're experiencing at that moment as her being upset because he's not there or he showed up late. That's actually true. She is upset that he's not there. But later on, the fullness of the story comes into play because you realize she was probably sad during their marriage because sometimes he missed things. But in the end, she's mad or she's upset because he's gone forever. And so what you see in the middle is actually fully fulfilled at the end. It's partially true in the middle, but it's fully true at the end. This kind of prophecy in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, where we see that a child will be born to them by an Alma, who is most likely a virgin, who already has conceived, as we've already seen through the interpretation, is partially possibly fulfilled. Maybe it's not, maybe it is. But even if it is partially fulfilled, it doesn't mean that it's not ultimately fulfilled in the end. So I think we can see these wonderful analogies that can help us to see that partial fulfillment does not mean that the ultimate fulfillment isn't true, or that someone was applying something to the prophecy that wasn't actually there. It's perfectly legitimate to think that it actually was meant to be partial and ultimate in Jesus.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit, because you made a point, and I think it's an important point to make, but you emphasize, and I want to know why you emphasize, because Ehrman makes a point that, by the way, the translation is not she will conceive. The translation is she has already conceived. And we would agree with Bart Ehrman here.
Yeah.
But what does that mean?
Yeah, and it's a funny thing because when you watch the video, you're thinking, okay, so he's debunked something, because people often think of, well, the prophecy is that she will conceive because of maybe the way that it's written in Matthew is that she will conceive. And so this is a prophecy of the future, and it's going to be about Mary. And so it's not really a big thing because this woman will conceive of a child, and by the time the kid is 2 years old, you'll be out of trouble, Ahaz, so don't worry about it. He's probably correct that the correct interpretation is that the Alma has already conceived. That doesn't mean she's not a virgin. In fact, it's that she will not conceive. His point actually proves too much, because what would be so miraculous about a prophecy that says a virgin will conceive? Well, everybody who has conceived the first time was a virgin at some point, so what's the big deal? Don't we expect a betrothed woman to conceive eventually? So it's not really that miraculous of a prophecy. But Ehrman goes to great pains to point out that it's that she already has conceived, as if she's not an Alma. But she is an Alma. She is betrothed, and she's currently a virgin and currently with child. That is a miracle. So Ehrman's interpretation of the passage is that it is prophesying a miracle, not a mundane fact. So that to me is actually much more strongly in favor of Matthew applying it to Jesus himself. Like I said, it proves too much, and that it agrees with the traditional Christian understanding of the prophecy. Understanding that Alma has conceived actually makes the prophecy clearer. That the unmarried yet betrothed, engaged virgin woman who has already conceived. Well, I got to say something. This fits the bill exactly for Mary. She is a virgin woman who is unmarried and yet betrothed, and she already has conceived by the time that she gets married. So this fits the bill perfectly. So in trying to disprove it, he actually goes a little further towards proving it.
Yeah, I think it's sort of the missing that, and I he's not a Hebrew scholar, and we've kind of consulted people that are experts in Hebrew to look at some of this. So, and I wonder if he had a more firm grasp on Alma, he would see that, like, oh, but Alma has already conceived. That's a problem. But so what I want to transition to next, and I think that's, people can pause here because that's an important point that you just made to sort of think about, that the already conceived is huge. But I want to transition a little bit now to even talk about, like, where did Matthew get this from? Did he have no understanding of the context? Was he just out on a limb here again, one more time, trying to prove something that wasn't really there? Because that's what a lot of like critical scholars will say about Matthew. But Matthew does not pull this out of thin air at all. This was very much within the sort of Jewish milieu at the time. And so, for instance, he's quoting from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so this part was potentially translated 200 years or so before Matthew ever wrote his gospel. And they translated the term Alma to Parthenos, which they mentioned in the video, that pretty much always means virgin. There's one exception in Genesis 34, verse 4, where this is used towards someone who's been kind of sexually abused. So that we can parse that out. But every other instance, it's clearly referencing someone who is a virgin. That it meant virgin essentially. And given that every translation is perhaps in some sense an interpretation, you see that here were some ancient Jewish people, trying to bring the Bible to the Greek culture they were now in, and they interpreted, before the Christians got their hands on it, they interpreted what Isaiah was saying as referring to a virgin. So that idea is already in the culture. This is not Christians making this up to try and prove something about Jesus. So this is what Matthew's doing, and I think what the Septuagint is doing, based on what we've already said about the Hebrew text, is these are faithful interpretations based on what people thought was going to be happening. And what the Septuagint did was they took out all vagueness in the term. That perhaps there was some vagueness there, but they just say Parthenos. We'll just say virgin, so everyone just gets it. It's very, these Greek people may not understand the Hebrew word to have all these nuances to it, so we'll just give them the word for virgin so that they get really clearly what the miraculous nature of this sign was going to be. So in other words, this sign was not a surprise pregnancy like Dr. Ehrman is trying to sort of say it is. It was it really was meant to be this miraculous sign. The sign was not simply that the child would be proof that God was going to save Israel, but rather the child himself was prophesied to be the salvation of Israel. And that is the key there, and that's what they understood at the time. And so ancient Jewish people viewed this so even outside of the Septuagint, and even in the early years after Christianity, they still viewed this text as messianic, sort of until Christians came along and they kind of changed their mind based on Christians' interpretation of it. And we see that a lot of like rabbinic Judaism sometimes is in direct response to um, Christian interpretation and theology, and that's why.
I want to pause for a moment there because
Yeah.
the point you're making is really important. I want you to make sure you're explicit about this because I don't want to be lost on anybody about the way in which sometimes the reaction to the way Christians have done things is to sort of create the opposite. So be a little more explicit in that. This is an important point.
Yeah. So, for instance, sometimes there are diacritical marks added to certain later Hebrew texts from the Middle Ages in order to make distinctions between. So when the psalmist says, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand," the Hebrew is just using the same word, but they make diacritical marks to make it sound like it's saying two different things. And actually, non-Trinitarian Christians will use this text as an argument against the Trinity because they're saying clearly this is two different beings. It's Adonai and Adoni. But those diacritical marks didn't exist when the original text was written. Another case would be even today in Orthodox synagogues, one of their sort of closing departing hymns specifically says, "God does not have a body." And so there's a lot of stuff that is sort of in reaction to what the Christians have said, but specifically in this text I'll go into because it's very interesting that the Babylonian Talmud states that that Hillel said that there would be no Messiah for Israel because they already had him in the days of Hezekiah. And this too, in Barakot 28b, they looked forward to the day of Hezekiah's return from the upper world, it says. And this last statement was soon after the destruction of the temple. So Jews were looking for hope, and but some actually doubted it because Zechariah 9:9 has a prophecy that of the returning king riding on a donkey, but Hezekiah had already died by that time. So ancient Jewish writers tended to focus more on Isaiah 9 as a messianic text, but considering the clear link between the child of Isaiah 9 and the one of Isaiah 7, it seems that the whole section was understood as pointing towards this messianic child to be born. And so there's an eminent Old Testament scholar named Jacob Neusner who actually admitted that Jewish writers began to abandon the claim that Hezekiah was the Messiah after Christians were claiming Jewish people had no Messiah to look forward to since Jesus had already come. And so the idea is that clearly Israel needs more help, and the Davidic king has not returned to rule forever. But if you say it's Hezekiah, you admit defeat because Hezekiah has come and gone and Israel's not doing so well. So if you can't say it's Christ, whose movement is taking over the world, you can't say it's him because you reject him. So you must say that you're still waiting on the Messiah to come. So we see in a few of these instances like this, these texts were clearly understood in context the way Matthew is understanding them in context. And why don't you talk about that a little bit? So like how Matthew is using the prophecy. But just to point out, these ancient Jewish interpretations, people understood them this way. As being miraculous and about the Messiah.
Yeah, and as you were talking, it occurred to me, and I was listening to the clip we were responding to, is that oftentimes when we hear people talk about the Septuagint as the Greek translation of the Old Testament, we think there's nothing Jewish about it because it's the Greeks. And I think sometimes if you're not versed enough or well-read enough into the Septuagint, you'd think that it's a bunch of Greeks translating this document they happen to have their hands on, and they translate it into Greek, and it's got a Hellenization to it, which is how you get these different interpretations of it that aren't necessarily Jewish.
Right.
Wrong. That's just not true. Mm-hmm. It was Jews who were interpreting and translating the Hebrew into the Greek, and they were trying to remove that ambiguity from it. So to say, I'm not saying that Ehrman's saying this, I'm saying that when we hear Greek translation of the Old Testament, we think it was a bunch of Greeks who were doing it, when in fact it was a bunch of Jews who were doing it, so that people who understood Greek would be able to understand what it is that the Bible's actually saying from the Hebrew. So As I was saying before, even if that prophecy had been partially fulfilled, it doesn't matter. Biblical prophecies had a penultimate and an ultimate fulfillment all the time. Passover and Pentecost themselves are two examples of this, two good examples. In fact, the Passover is one of the reasons why, in fact, Christians celebrate Good Friday as a specific link to the Old Testament, is that a lamb was slain in the Passover times. The blood was spread on the lintels and doorposts of the door so that the angel or the spirit of death would not go into the Jewish homes, the Hebrew homes, and kill the firstborn, but would go into the Egyptians. And so the spirit of death had passed over, the spirit of the Lord had passed over those homes. And so they were saved by the shedding of the blood of a lamb. And of course, later on, that's exactly how Christians understood the messianic prophecy to be in the historical, actual death of Jesus and his shedding of blood. So there was an immediate fulfillment of something. Moses was warned, do this, and it was a type and a shadow of what was to come. This happens all the time, and there's plenty of cases like that. So even a partial fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 7, which may not have happened, but let's say it did happen, doesn't debunk the ultimate fulfillment in Jesus. And second, Matthew shows in the gospel that he can go between the Greek and the Hebrew texts, as he does. For instance, he uses the Hebrew text of Hosea, chapter 11, verse 1, when discussing the infant Jesus' return from Egypt in Matthew 2:15. And so that's in line with the translators of the Septuagint. He goes with them and he clears out any ambiguities like in Isaiah chapter 7:14. So when it's important to communicate in Greek in his gospel, something that is better communicated less ambiguously in Greek, he goes with that. And when it's better to use the original Hebrew to communicate something, he goes with that. So Matthew can traffic in both Hebrew and Greek, and there's no problem for him to do so. Why? Because he knows that the Greek translation of the Old Testament in the Septuagint is by Hebrews and Jews who knew what they were talking about when they were looking at those Old Testament prophecies.
Yeah, so Matthew seems to see it largely as this. This is the ultimate fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14, including the original context about the rescue of Judah and the coming destruction. So here's one way you could kind of think of this, I think, is that an actual betrothed virgin gave birth to the actual Messiah, who is actually Emmanuel, God with us, whose kingdom will actually never end in order to actually save people from the ultimate coming destruction. All of that is within Matthew.
Yeah, and it's perfectly reasonable to see him thinking of all that. All this is in line with the ancient understandings of the Hebrew words. The Isaiah context comes into play here, the Septuagint interpretation, the ancient Jewish expectations, and the non-critical historical method used by ancient interpreters. What I mean by that is that people who don't decide to go with this critical method where let's assume things are wrong, you take all of this, the corpus of the material, like I said, the Hebrew words, the Isaiah context, the Septuagint, the ancient expectations of the Jews, and people who are not necessarily trying to see how this doesn't apply. If you take it from that point of view, it all adds up. It all comes into what you just, I think, beautifully summarized as the actual prophecy being fulfilled in a very specific way about God who is with us and his kingdom never ends.
Yeah, and we talked in the last episode about this sort of biblical colonialism idea. And that's essentially when you're talking about the historical critical method of understanding these texts. Again, that's fine. You can gain insights from that by trying to figure out what they would have maybe understood most directly, as much as you can figure that out. But again, that's not how they used texts in the ancient world. That's not what they were. That's not what they were used for. That's not how they were situated in those communities. And it's really important to understand how did they work within those communities. And again, not understanding them through later, rejections of Christianity or even, later sort of statements in favor of Christianity. It's just, can we understand how they were used then? And I think you'll see that the authors of the New Testament are not using these texts in any way other than how they had been used during that time anyway. And I think we see Matthew doing that. But while we're I know we're running a little long here, but let's give them let's give them two bonus questions to discuss
Yeah.
real quick. One, uh, why is there not a birth narrative in the Gospel of John? We know from the Gospel of Mark. I mean, he's being very punchy with everything. It's the shortest gospel. He's getting to the point. He's, the last third of Mark's gospel, I think, is all about the last week of Jesus's life. So it's all sort of like, okay, let's get to the point. Then boom, here's what I really want to tell you about. So there's that. Why isn't there a birth narrative in the Gospel of John, especially since he's so theological, so blatantly theological? But
Yeah.
also, why is the virgin birth like the sticking point for, a lot of atheists, and Dawkins will constantly bring up, if he's trying to figure out if someone is like, when he talks to Jordan Peterson, it is, okay, you say this, you say that, but do you believe in an actual virgin birth? And he said this when he said he was a cultural Christian, this was a thing. But, by that, I don't mean I believe in a virgin birth. I mean, I like, Christmas carols. So, a couple of questions there dealing with that, but let's start with the Gospel of John. Why is there no birth narrative in the Gospel of John?
Yeah, and one can speculate, of course, because I haven't asked the Apostle John yet. I will eventually probably get a chance to do that, and ask him, so why didn't you include that? However, I think that there's a couple of reasons that you can look in the face of the gospel itself and maybe surmise an answer. Is first, John goes way before a virgin birth to the actual birth, the virgin birth of Jesus, to the actual birth of the universe. When he goes back, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so he's talking about the eternality of Jesus. His focus, theologically speaking, is on the eternality of Jesus. And so he goes even further back than his virgin birth. And later on, you see in various parts of John where he says, Father, glorify me with the glory I had before the foundation of the world. So he's talking about this sort of this eternal existence of Jesus. But his birth does come up, or at least the legitimacy of his birth does come up. In John chapter 8, what you see is the religious leaders sort of challenging Jesus on the legitimacy of his even station to be lecturing them in the first place. Like, we know who our father is. We know our father Abraham, but you don't even know who your dad is. Maybe you're not even really all that Jewish. The implication here being sort of the traditional chastisement, or the way they poked at Jesus and his mother by saying, you're not really Jewish. What you are is, sure, you're virgin born, but you're really the child of rape. The traditional thing being that Pantera, a Jewish a Roman soldier, had raped Mary, and that's what produced Jesus. And the possibility here in John chapter 8 is they're getting at Jesus for your illegitimacy.
Yeah.
And then Jesus, of course, says, I know who my dad is. I know who my father is. You guys are children of the devil. Abraham himself. You say Abraham's your dad? Well, then you will rejoice, because Abraham, your supposed father, saw my day and was glad. In other words, he's saying, I am legitimately born of the line of Abraham. So there is, in essence, a reference to Jesus' birth, but the point of John is not to dwell on necessarily the fulfillment of prophecy of the Old Testament. We have other sources for that, but that Jesus actually predates all of it. So we don't need a virgin birth story to legitimize Jesus. We have the legitimization of Jesus as the one who created everything in the first place.
Yeah, and just like we talked about, before, with these different the different focus each one has. Matthew takes them to Abraham, because they're showing, and he focuses on Abraham and David in exile in his generations, because he's showing him as, he's he's the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, the fulfillment of the promise of the eternal king, and he is the one who is bringing them out of exile in this new sort of Passover moment. So he's making that point. Luke takes it back a little further to Adam, saying he's the God over all Jews and Gentiles, and he doesn't. John takes it back even further. He's the eternally begotten Son of the Father. So, like you just mentioned, before Abraham was, I am. So again, using I am language too to identify himself with God. So, yeah, very interesting there. The way that the different Gospels talk about that, I find very fascinating. Yeah.
Go ahead.
You mentioned, I mentioned, but this whole virgin birth issue that's so like incredible to believe. And I mean, it's a miracle, obviously, it is. But why is this the thing that often comes up as like this is the litmus test? Are you crazy or are you not? Okay, you can be a Christian as long as you don't believe in everything literally. And here's the thing you can't believe in literally.
Yeah, and I part of me wonders whether or not it's because there's no, unlike when you make an argument for the resurrection, which would be probably just equally as implausible on a naturalistic framework that someone could die and then rise from the dead. There's not all this corroborating evidence, Tacitus and Josephus and all these different things that come together on this. Is that virgin birth seems to have no corroborating evidence outside of the biblical narrative itself. And so it seems incredibly just like you just threw it in there to state a miracle claim, but there's no corroborating evidence for it. And it's wild. It's crazy. Former colleague of both of ours, Vince Vitale, once talked about this when he said someone had just piped up and said, I can't believe in a virgin birth. And he says, well, wait a minute. If you believe in that the universe came from nothing, don't you believe something more miraculous than a virgin birth? I mean, you're saying it literally came from nothing, ex nihilo. There's not even a father involved, let alone a virgin mother. There's not even a mother involved in that. It's just everything out of nothing. So it seems that they would actually believe in some form of virgin birth.
Yeah.
And that virgin birth is far more fantastical outside of a God existing in a naturalistic framework than it would be for a God who exists in a universe that was already created and decided to use a woman to bring about a virgin-born child. That seems far less implausible than the universe came from literally nothing. And then you see people, Lawrence Krauss and others, who are trying to basically justify that the nothing we're talking about is really not nothing in the classical sense of not anything, but is, quantum fluctuations or whatever it might be. So it's something, but we say it's nothing because it's not really matter, but it's something. And so there's this whole hand-wringing over what nothing actually means. And somehow we're okay with that. We're okay with the universe coming from nothing, and there's no God involved. But a virgin birth, well, that's just crazy. It seems to me that you're talking about, on a naturalistic framework, competing absurdities, and the virgin birth is far less absurd than everything coming from nothing.
Yeah, and this, again, it's a matter of definition. Ehrman doesn't know quite what Alma means. Krauss doesn't know quite what nothing means. If we could just get these words down and understand what we're talking about, I think we could make more sense. But well, thank you for that. I think that helps to clear those up, because that is interesting that people who would believe in everything from nothing would have a problem with a virgin birth. But let's wrap it up here. I would we've gone over a lot. It is the Christmas season, so let's put a bow on it. What are your closing arguments for this? I know we covered a lot, but as best you can, what do you want people to take home from this?
Yeah, I think the primary thing, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is to take away that you have to understand how an argument actually works and how a statement might actually work when someone is maybe poking at something and saying it's not legitimate. I take someone like Ehrman, Dr. Ehrman, and others like him, right, who might just, their tactic is to not allow anything to be legitimate in the Christian view. And we have to be careful of this, by the way, as Christians as well, is that we're not guilty of the same kind of tactic where we allow nothing that the other side or an opposing view says as legitimate. Sometimes they make legitimate points, and we have to deal with that. I don't even think the legitimate points don't really make the ultimate conclusion that there is no God, but we have to allow for good points to stand on their own and see where they lead. What I think we've seen in this particular instance is that the objection that Isaiah could not possibly have been referring to Jesus in terms of the prophecy of a virgin is simply wrong. It very easily and more likely than not is referring to a unmarried, betrothed virgin woman out of all of the options available, and that it ultimately was fulfilled in the person of Jesus. And that when Matthew quotes a prophecy saying that he shall be called a Nazarene, as we saw in part 1, that there are the possibilities that Matthew just misinterpreted something, or someone made something up, or there was an effort to legitimize Jesus' birth in Nazareth as somehow meaningful, and that it was fabricated. That's a possibility. The more likely thing, however, is that no, when Matthew was referring to the prophets, plural, he was being general in saying that the entirety of what they were saying is referring to Jesus as the kind of person you'd think of as a Nazarene, someone unlovely, someone unnoticeable, someone who might even be despised, but could be the branch of David. We don't take uncharitable views of something and then congratulate ourselves when we disprove that uncharitable view. That's straw manning, and we can't do that. Dr. Ehrman and others like him who do this, and all of us who do this, by the way, could take a lesson from Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel, a professor of philosophy out of New York University, who was a brilliant, brilliant man, an atheist. And he was discussing his questioning of the prevailing neo-Darwinian theories and their philosophical assumptions and how we even got human consciousness in the first place. And he's talking about the intelligent design movement, and he's not talking about it derisively as someone who is an atheist. This is what he says, and this is a good attitude to have, I think, generally speaking. I'm going to apply this to our discussion of the Christmas narratives. Nagel says about the intelligent design movement, in thinking about these questions, I have been stimulated by criticisms of the prevailing scientific world picture from a very different direction. The attack on Darwinism mounted in recent years from a religious perspective by the defenders of intelligent design. Even though writers like Michael Behe and Stephen Meyer are motivated at least in part by their religious beliefs, the empirical arguments they offer against the likelihood that the origin of life and its evolutionary history can be fully explained by physics and chemistry are of great interest in themselves. He's saying the arguments are good and we should look at them. Another skeptic, David Berlinski, has brought out these problems vividly without referencing to the design inference. This is the important part. Even if one is not drawn to the alternative of an explanation by the actions of a designer, the problems that these iconoclasts, meaning Behe and Meyer and Berlinski, point out, the problems that these iconoclasts pose for the orthodox scientific consensus should be taken seriously. They do not deserve the scorn with which they are commonly met. It is manifestly unfair. He's not coming at that with believer bias. This is an atheist talking about the design argument. I think we can apply that equally to the biblical narrative of the virgin birth and the prophecies that Matthew is referring to, both the explicit one in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, and the more general one that he refers to as that he shall be called a Nazarene. There are plenty of reasons to believe that these are good and valid references to good and valid prophecies, both generally and specifically. And what do they point to? They point to a Savior of the world who is born of a virgin, who fulfills all the prophecies of Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, who eventually dies on a cross to save us from the death that we all deserve, and rises from the dead to prove that he has power over death. This Christmas, friends, as we give at least some shrift to the Christian claim, what I would urge you, if you're a skeptic, is to look not only at the possibility that Jesus was virgin born, but the history of his death and then his resurrection. Because at Christmas time, we're not just celebrating the birth of someone who started a political movement or someone who started a social change idea in a hostile environment. No, the reason we celebrate Christmas is because it is the birth of the Prince of Peace, the one who through his death and resurrection has broken down the dividing wall of hostility, and he himself has become our peace. That's who we celebrate this Christmas, that he is the reason for the season for a specific reason, and that is his resurrection and the gift of life that he gives to you and to me. Let's focus there this Christmas. Until next time, friends, the defense rests.